Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. Oh my gosh, y'all, I am so excited for this session. You can't believe how excited I am. But yes, hello and welcome. My name is Arc Telos Saint Amor. It's a very long name, so most folks call me Tay, but it's all affirming. My mandatory pronouns are they, them, their, and I'm the executive director of Youth Move National and your moderator for today's session. So we're going to get started right away, but I just have a couple of housekeeping things that I've been told to remind everybody of. So I'm going to jump into those now. And if you've heard it before, if you've been in these sessions already today, it's just a little bit of a reminder. But do want to ensure that we are creating safe, brave, equitable, affirming, and accountable spaces for you today. So just wanting to remind everyone of that commitment that we made to be in community together, to be present with together, and to really kind of hold up to those community standards and agreements. And if you want to be reminded of that, when you're in the reception area of EarMeet, you can kind of see that statement right there. So just kind of reminding everyone, slow down, prime with intentions, and let's bring our best selves to this session today. Also, just quickly, if you don't know, it's always important to level set. You have a vertical toolbar on the left-hand side of your screen. So you should see 4 little boxes, and then below that will be our chat section. So if you want to throw things into the chat, please do so. But what's more important is actually the section right below it, which is the Q&A section. So I'm going to be monitoring the chat throughout the session as best as I can, but I'm really, really encouraging folks, all questions, please get them into that Q&A box. It's going to be a little bit hard to translate them from the chat. So please, 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 if you have questions, ask them, just get them into that Q&A box. Okay, at any time, if you need a break, you need to self-care, decompress, anything you need to do, please, 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 we welcome you as you are. Take care of yourself. If you exit the session on your top left-hand side of your screen, you should see the wellness room. So if you click in there, there is staff members available to help folks decompress, to talk, to self-care. We have some animal cams in there that are pretty awesome. So please just take care of yourself. Okay, without further ado, let me stop talking and introduce you to some amazing folks. This is Youth Power and Policy Making, the youth mental health crisis and Gen Z's role in tackling it. I want to welcome to the stage, y'all, Youth Power Project.
Hi everyone, it is so great to be here. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so kind of have something to follow along with as we give our little presentation today. Sorry, 1 second. Beautiful. Everyone can see this? Okay, amazing. Yeah, so we are the Youth Power Project. Today we're going to be talking about youth power and policymaking, the youth mental health crisis, and my generation's role in tackling it, what we have done so far, and what we still want, envision we need to do. To introduce myself, my name is Katie Chen. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a second year undergraduate studying at Columbia University. However, I did grow up in the Bay Area, and it is a combination of these experiences, growing up in the Bay and in college, that have really highlighted to me just how much mental health affects every part of our being and why I'm here today. Zami, do you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Sonvi. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a second year undergraduate at UC Berkeley. And I'm the executive director for the Youth Power Project. And like Katie, I think it's a combination of a lot of life experiences that have kind of taught me and made me really passionate about giving young people the tools to turn their experiences into law. And that's something I'm really excited to talk about with y'all today. Ria?
Hi everyone, my name is Ria. I use she, her pronouns as well. And I'm a first year undergraduate at UCLA. Um, and yeah, I'm the mental health policy co-lead at the Youth Power Project. And I'm really excited to sort of talk about how we sort of take our experiences and, turn them into policies, and really excited to be here with you all today.
Yes. Thank you guys so much. I also forgot to mention I also, yeah, work with mental health policy as part of the Youth Power Project, which we will talk a little bit more about later. But for now, just to kind of set the stage for today's presentation, we have three main goals. Number one, why we are here is to highlight the importance of lived experiences in the adolescent mental health and advocacy spheres. I think something that like something that's so important about working in these like youth spaces is that youth are the ones being affected by these policies, and as a result, we are the ones who are often best primed to speak about what's going well, what's not going well. So we kind of want to share some maybe like lived experiences, case studies of how exactly we have turned our lived experiences into tangible policy, and how people can do the same. The second point is to share youth-generated best practices for engaging youth in advocacy and institutional decision-making spaces. Just because the Youth Power Project, as you'll hear more about, is a completely youth-run organization. Part of our goal is to engage more students in these spaces. We have sort of tested out, trial and error, various strategies for engaging youth. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what has worked best for us, as well as point three is to work with you all to identify intergenerational strategies to better engage impacted youth in brainstorming, devising, supporting local, state, and federal programs and policies. If you guys are comfortable, I would love to hear kind of what organizations you are here on behalf of. Kind of, are you guys also youth or adult allies, or kind of where you fall in terms of like sort of this generational presence, but we really want to sort of start building these sustainable systems of engaging with adult allies that really helps us make our work like more sustainable. And just sort of to help that, we are going to be having like various points of discussion, collaboration during the presentation. We're still trying to figure out if breakout rooms are possible, but just in case they're not, we've created a Jamboard. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's kind of like a virtual like whiteboard where people can add their like answers, thoughts to, and see other people's responses. So if you guys are like are able to right now, I would love for you guys to go to that link, like enter www.tinyurl.com/soc-24-ypp in your browser. And we'll be sort of referring to this Jamboard and directing you guys to put answers, read other people's answers throughout this presentation. But without further ado, I'll pass out to Sanvi to talk more about the Youth Power Project.
Thank you so much, Katie. Yeah, I'm so excited to kind of provide a little bit of framing as to what YPP is. YPP is an organization we're entirely youth-run, and we aim to break down barriers between lawmakers and young people by directly centering the stories and voices of young people in policymaking at the local, state, and federal level. For all of us at YPP, we kind of, at the crux of our work lies this understanding that advocacy is very personal. Advocacy is our connections to different civic institutions, different civic processes is very individual. And what brings us all together in these spaces is our lived experiences and our personal experiences. That being said, especially in the context of policymaking, there's like a really big gap between actually understanding the needs of impacted communities and then devising policies that can effectively address those needs. So to us, it's really important that young people can view public policy as a tool to advocate for themselves. A lot of the times when we talk about advocacy and talk about civic engagement in the context of young people, we view voting or we place certain ideals on what that civic engagement can look like. But it's really important to us that young people feel empowered to look at creative or sometimes delusional mechanisms to advocate for themselves, whether that be writing a bill or speaking to a local lawmaker, whatever they think might be best. And that's kind of where YPP emerged. Next slide, please. That being said, a lot of our organizing pillars kind of fall under these big three categories. One is direct action, and the second is community outreach, and the third is education. It's really important to us that we kind of that all of these three pillars work in tandem towards envisioning a system that effectively consults and brings young people to the forefront of youth-oriented decision-making. It was really a transformative experience for me, and I think for Katie and Ria too. We talk about this all the time, to be able to learn that we could advocate for ourselves in such a manner. And I think that we want to make sure that we can create a peer-based platform through YPP for other young people to leverage these systems as well. Ria?
Yeah, so what does this look like? Direct action, what we mean by direct action is involving taking immediate public steps to achieving our specific goal. And so at YPP, we have a variety of issue areas, but specifically our aim is to bring attention to urgent issues and prompt immediate responses from decision makers. And so how do we do that? A lot of the things that we do at YPP is writing and informing system-oriented policies and really just involving youth into these policy spaces. So we focus on creating and informing policy that address systemic issues, that includes drafting, researching, advocating for policies that lead to sustainable change. And our goal is really to ensure that these policies are grounded in realities and the needs of, communities that are affected and, really centering the youth perspective. And we really also emphasize peer advocacy as it empowers, and advocates for youth that have similar and shared experiences to amplify their voices and have their experiences heard in the policies that are represented in the state and national and congressional levels. And yeah, so we also offer, not only peer like systems because Youth Power Project is sort of an organization for youth, but we also, provide resources to equip young advocates who maybe not don't know too much about policy in the initial stages to garner their skills and support themselves and other peers in creating policies. And another big pillar or how we create direct action is creating long-lasting mechanisms for youth representation in decision-making in institutions. And so what we mean by that is ensuring that the policies are really reflective of what the youth want and youth experiences. And so this also means establishing permanent seats for youth in various institutions. Like Sanvi said, another pillar at YPP is community outreach. And so we really emphasize engaging directly with community partners and the community on understanding their needs and the concerns that are vital. And then we also conduct, you know, um, listen listening circles and listening to our peers in our community to ensure that the policies that we create and are really representative of the whole community. Yeah, and then we also really emphasize within community outreach, hosting listening sessions, forums to really hear the youth, impacted youth lived experiences to see the intersecting groups and like garner insights on gaps and the needs. And lastly, the education portion, we like to call it like a policy incubator. And so this is a really big way in like demystifying the policy and public policy processes and the system. So this program guides youth through a step of policy and policy creation and advocacy. Yeah. And our just general goal at YPP is to cultivate a new generation of informed and active youth civic leaders, which is, I guess, the basis of all three pillars. So our strategy. So what we specifically do, really, garnering those three pillars that we stated before is drafting and informed legislation, in Congress and state legislators, and we've done this with our House Resolution 434, which I believe we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, our RAISE Act and peer-to-peer infrastructure bills. We really, emphasize identifying youth needs in informing bipartisan priorities. So we really do this with local forums and then coalescing diverse stakeholders and leveraging intergenerational partnerships with our CARE coalition. So we can go into this a little bit later in the presentation as well, but it's a coalition of not only youth organizations, but also adult organizations that focus on youth mental health or mental health in general. So we can create, a shared community agreement and a shared list of issue areas that we aim to address with not only in a national conversation, but also in a state and local perspective as well. And then the last thing that we do within our strategy is informing the public narrative. And so we do this with social media engagement, op-eds, because, the way to our generation is largely through social media. So we really focus on doing like Instagram lives and, engaging in our Instagram and our Twitter.
Yeah, so I think I'll pass it off to Sami to share a little bit more about kind of why youth, experiences are so important. It's kind of a case study for how our organization has sort of transformed lived experiences into actual policy.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to understand what the I think a lot of times when we're talking about lived experiences, people talk about storytelling, they talk about peer circles, they talk about different spaces for the purposes of cultivating like policy responses. And I think something that we've kind of experienced through YPP or learned a lot about, especially working with young people and working with peers, is the importance of open and honest communication and storytelling spaces that are brave and safe. I think like when I was first getting involved in like the mental health advocacy space, I was 14, I was like or 15, I was like in the 10th grade in high school. And this was also during the pandemic. So it was kind of like interesting because a lot of people were talking about mental health during the pandemic. It kind of became a lot more. I think during the pandemic, we did move the needle a little bit on destigmatizing mental health at its face. And so a lot of people were talking about mental health. And I know it came up a lot with my peers. And I think it was really only through understanding that my experiences like struggling with my mental health were collective and shared did I feel empowered in advocating for myself. I never really saw myself as somebody who could like be an advocate for myself in like a lawmaking or like a civic perspective. Even I was like the most civically apathetic person ever. Like before the pandemic, like I was like I didn't really know what a bill was. I didn't really understand the state legislature. I just couldn't. You could ask me and I probably wouldn't have much to say. And so that being said, I think it was really through having, I guess, personal experiences and then realizing that those experiences were shared that I developed like a passion or like this anger almost to want to like change something in my community and change something in my state. So I got kind of started with state level advocacy at that point and worked on a few pieces of state legislation with a friend who had actually written that legislation. And being able to like work with a peer and see someone my age who like wrote their own bill was like so inspiring to me. And I was like, that's so cool that like they went through something like me and like they were able to like change the law because they realized that like this was a systemic issue that like, you know, span beyond themselves. I think that kind of like process of being able to step outside of yourself, one, it was like really helpful for me to achieve closure in like my own personal life, but two, I think it was like really transformative in teaching me what it really means to access civic institutions, and that, you know, you don't need to be someone with the end goal of being a politician or with like a career goal of like becoming a politician to be a valued stakeholder in public policy. I think at the end of the day, age is not a determinant for your stakeholdership in public policy. Neither is like your intention for advocating for yourself. Like I said before, advocacy is such a human experience. It's an extension of your existence almost in the context of a broader community. So that being said, I think it's really, really important and vital for decision makers to be actively consulting with impacted communities. But at the end of the day, impacted communities also need to have the ability or have the resources and the empowerment to go and seek out these civic institutions to better their daily life. And so that in that regard, I think when we talk about experience-driven policymaking, it has to be bidirectional. And what we've seen with this House resolution that we kind of authored, when I was like 15, I kind of like worked like some of my experiences, like definitely my personal experiences in the mental health space definitely shaped kind of like or informed my purview on, you know, what systemic issues look like for me. But I think being able to come together with my peers and realize that like there was a myriad of intersecting systemic problems that were affecting all of us and what exactly we wanted to see to realize a better future for ourselves, that was like a transformative conversation for me. And I'll pass it off to Katie to kind of talk about how that turned into like federal legislation really quick.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Sanvi, for kind of talking about your experiences and how you got started in this space. Like, it's kind of funny because I had a very similar, we had very similar timelines, I think, for how we got involved in advocacy. And Sanvi, I think, touched on a really great point. It was realizing that so many people across the so many youth, students across the United States, across California, but also just the broader kind of university system were sharing in the same feelings as us about sort of mental health, and that like when we start talking about our own mental health, we realize that a lot of us noticed the same gaps in the system, the same areas that needed, reform. And so we thought, like, clearly something is wrong. Why don't we do something about it? Why don't we write policy and encourage lawmakers? Like, even though we can't vote yet, like, there has to be something we can do to actually start like causing change in the system. So that's kind of where House Resolution 434 came about. So it's a House resolution declaring a youth mental health crisis in the United States. I think one statistic that when I first got into this space, it just really shocked me is that like 49.5%, nearly half of all youth in the United States have experienced mental health conditions of some sort at every point, which is just like between two people. Take any two people, like, at least like one of them has been touched by mental health in some way in a personal manner. I think that is just such a shocking statistic for me. And so basically, this resolution lays out a set of 5 priorities that are informed by conversations we've had with students across the United States. And saying, there is a crisis, and these are what we want lawmakers to prioritize when they create policies to address this crisis. It was introduced by Representative Moulton in May 2023. It is a bipartisan sort of resolution, meaning that and I think like this is unfortunately a broader reality that mental health has somehow become politicized during the pandemic, and it really should not be. So I think this resolution is a step towards making the statement that mental health affects everyone. It doesn't really matter which political party you're a part of. It is something that we all need to come together on and to try and change collectively. But so what are these like 5 priorities that we realized when we were talking with youth? The first one was that there is this greater need to invest in mental health in school systems specifically because students spend so much of their time, in their school, whether it's a K through 12 system or even a collegiate university system. Pretty much 80% of our lives have something to do with school. So this is where we need, honestly, the most resources to be invested in, whether that is investing in more counselors, in establishing sort of systems of continuity when, school counselors aren't enough. How can we connect students to greater more effective mental health resources? I think part of this also comes with establishing systems first to sort of focus on recovery instead of penalization for students. I think there's a lot of sort of ignorance, not just with students, but also with teachers, exactly what mental health is about. And sometimes we don't necessarily get the grace we need from teachers and professors. So sort of establishing procedures for making sure that mental health is treated in the same way as physical health concerns is definitely a huge priority for us, as well as the fact that we see a lot of news stories about people, especially on schools, who end up sort of criminalizing mental health crises instead of giving students the proper recovery and support they need. So that is definitely a huge priority as well. Takes me to the second point, which is just recognizing the holistic impacts of mental health. For too long, mental health has been seen as a sort of it's all in your head, and this is a form of rhetoric that is very much present in the Bay Area, sort of where I grew up, and this is a very personal sort of point for me, where we're told to ignore mental health, to focus on school, on other things until it becomes too late and we're in a crisis. And at that point, what can you possibly do to address mental health? So it is so important to understand how mental health affects you, physically, emotionally, far before we get into any sort of physical crisis. Part of the whole holistic impacts of mental health thing is also realizing that mental health affects students who are younger, who affects children as well, people who are in elementary school, middle school. Mental health can start very early, and it's important that we recognize it as soon as possible to have more effective preventive methods. Third priority is, addressing stigma. I think a stigma is something that we talk about and acknowledge a lot, but we kind of just, we use stigma as a justification for why things about mental health haven't changed. We say, oh, there's so much stigma around mental health, that's just how it is, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so a huge priority is through education, through kind of showing people what mental health actually is, how to cultivate, better mental health practices that we can really combat stigma. This is kind of where lived experiences of humanizing the experience of depression, of anxiety, of making people realize there's people in their communities who share in these experiences, where it really is important. Also, a big focus here in this priority is the idea of community-based and peer-to-peer treatment models. I know, unfortunately, as much as we would like to invest in counselors for every single school system, there are constraints on funding, but peer-to-peer models are really great sort of lower cost ways of not only making students feel, normalized because their peers also share this experience, but also sort of alternative method of providing support for students on sort of a low like funding constraints. Number four, of course, is engaging high risk and medically isolated populations. So when I say like medically isolated, I kind of mean communities that have been pushed aside by medical institutions. So communities of color, rural communities, indigenous communities that don't necessarily have access to the same sort of counseling, mental health resources as students in more privileged communities. So finding ways to not only outreach and educate these communities, but also actually bringing resources to them, investing more in these communities. The fifth point is just addressing the inadequate mental health support within criminal justice system. We see a lot of times there's a complete like abandonment of youth who have entered criminal justice systems, ignoring their mental health, their physical health, and there is such a and sort of when you do this, you create these cycles of recriminalization. If there are mental health issues that just go completely unaddressed, that is going to follow youth who have entered the criminal justice system for the rest of their lives. So that is a huge priority as well. But kind of what does this mean? And why are we talking about this? And I think this is to show just, how youth lived experiences of talking to students across the US have actually helped shape and write tangible policy. I think what we can take away from this sort of case study is that youth have ideas and solutions, and it's really important to keep them engaged in these spaces so that there is this collaboration, this sort of like bi-directional collaboration between youth and policymakers that can keep shaping what the future of mental health support looks like. But that kind of brings the question, what exactly did youth empowerment in a civic context look like? So I think Sanvi's going to talk a little bit more about what kind of this engagement to us looks like, what sustainable youth empowerment looks like.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Katie. I think it's really important to us. Like one thing that has been so helpful in our journey is learning from experts and being able to appropriately work with organizations that, like I said, it's important, or like Katie has mentioned, it's important to understand the holistic nature of mental health, and also that we can't necessarily operate in silos when addressing the mental health crisis. So while I think it's really important to empower youth, effective youth empowerment acknowledges that, age is not a siloing factor of your identity that solely determines your experience with mental health. Obviously, there's an intersection across different community groups, and like how we even define someone's identity in relationship to their health and well-being obviously plays a huge role in terms of how their experience within these systems and what that ends up looking like. So I think when we're talking about effective youth empowerment, it's really important to recognize that, and we're coming into this conversation with that recognition that it's really important for us to work with allying organizations to ensure that like they're effectively empowering youth within their decision-making processes and vice versa. So what does effective youth empowerment actually look like to us? I think that we've kind of boiled this down to like two main principles. The one is effective inclusion, and the second is legitimate representation. Within the umbrella of effective inclusion, we really want to ensure that when young people are consulted in decision-making processes, this is outside of even just the traditional legislative process. This is within any decision-making process. And I can, provide an example within like our university. I go to to UC Berkeley. So like within our UC system, how they consult young people, it needs to be holistic. The young people need to have a voice from the start to the finish. I think a lot of the times we see young people brought in towards the end to like sign off on something that has already been written. But I think ensuring that they are co-creating with other allying groups is really, really important. The second is that effective inclusion has to be intentional. There needs to be a pathway to actually incorporate feedback or youth contributions into the final outcome. There have been many, many times where I feel like young people are consulted and they'll fill out a survey or provide some kind of input that's never actually realized in or included or incorporated in the final product. And I think that it's hard at that point to really feel empowered in that circumstance when you feel like, your inclusion is merely superficial and not necessarily tangible. And the last is that it has to be sustainable. There needs to be attitudinal and financial support to sustain engagement. So I think it's really important that when we're talking about youth empowerment, that you can actually attitudinally and financially that you are ready for that. I think one thing that is often one misconception is that, when you're empowering young people, you can kind of like ask them to volunteer their time or kind of exploit their time without pay or compensation. That's a little bit difficult because at this, a lot of the times young people are willing to volunteer their time, but if they feel attitudinally or financially disregarded, if they feel like people aren't ready for their input, that is more disempowering than it is empowering. And then moving to legitimate representation. I think this is more of a mindset shift for us. It's like really I think effective youth empowerment comes pretty naturally when you recognize that young people have unique expertise on their own needs, and that students, and young people have powerful solutions to respond to those needs. I think that that's at times something that we tell other young people who are entering this space is that, hey, your age is not a determinant for whether or not you are a stakeholder. At the same time, your lived experience is a necessary and needed qualification in and of itself. And I think that's an important recognition that kind of underscores underscores the necessity for empowering youth spaces. And I think that kind of acknowledgement can also pave the way for those looking to empower young people in their decision making to avoid the following next slide. I guess the following examples of what youth empowerment doesn't look like. Ineffective inclusion. So what is ineffective? I think tokenizing is pretty ineffective. Limiting the opportunity to actually incorporate the input within the final outcome is quite ineffective. And I think it's important to understand that this is perceptible amongst young people. This is something that, and I feel like it's not just young people. I feel like with impacted communities, when we are trying to consult them, it is pretty evident when that consultation is merely to assign a box rather than to actually effectively incorporate their experience or their insight within the final outcome. Asking too late, like I said earlier, asking for sign off rather than including young people in the ideation process is particularly repetitive example. A lot of the times, even in the crafting of policy, asking for hey, do you think this is okay, rather than what would you like to see reflected in this language, is an example of where this might not be as effective. And also replacing ideation with busy work. Sometimes it's people might be given busy work in these kinds of contexts rather than be given being given ideation capacity or the ability to start from start to finish or holistically and provide their input. That being said, it's really important for there to be sustainable requests for contribution. So some examples of unsustainable requests for contribution include not compensating or not valuing time from young people. I think there is particular scenarios where it's hard to compensate monetarily. So I think this can also be attitudinal. A lot of the times, I do, or I've heard from young people, or we've seen young people being brought into decision-making processes and almost being overworked or not, that their work boundaries not being respected. For example, if you're asking students to take time off of school, making sure that they have a support system in place or that they have the necessary documentation so that they can receive support academically, and then also devaluing their limits and boundaries. Sometimes that might happen implicitly, and so it's really important to just be cognizant of volunteer time, but also if it's possible to provide any additional compensation, that's obviously very, very helpful. And finally, implicit and explicit biases. We can do a whole entire presentation on bias and kind of where it comes from and all the harmful impacts of bias. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with what bias means, but this definitely is something that that impacts youth participation and willingness and proclivity to participate in these spaces as well. When you feel disproportionately limited in your engagement, for example, a lot of the times you'll bring young people into spaces and then they'll be the only ones without a vote. Right, that's an example of disproportionately limiting their engagement in a process in comparison to other consulted stakeholders. So even small things like that might appear oh, this is not that big of a deal. It can demonstrate an implicit or explicit even unwillingness to fully engage these participants. And finally, depreciating student contributions. So, saying things oh, this is so good for someone who's your age, but in a more condescending way than what I just said. I don't want to be mean, so I'm not going to try to be mean, but you know what I mean. It's depreciating student contributions. I think across the board can be particularly harmful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sanvi, for setting up such a good platform on, what involving students in these spaces look like. And so I guess I'll delve a little bit more into the barriers in which we see the barriers we see youth facing when they come in the system or before they come in the system. And so I just want you guys to think to yourself, what are some barriers you may have noticed? A few barriers that came to our eyes as youth in these spaces are a lack of knowledge, a lack of visibility and trust, a lack of time and capacity, and turnover and limited longevity. And so we'll go a little bit more in depth into what each of these mean. So the power of knowing or not. What do we mean by this? We mean lack of knowledge. So many young people are super eager to get involved, but they don't necessarily know where to start. And so this largely is due to a lack of information about opportunities for civic engagement. They don't really know where to find them. That could be a communication error with organization and the youth, or just youth aren't getting where they can get involved. That is a really big thing because I know when I started out, I was like, I don't even know where I could apply any of this to. I don't know what I can even bring to these spaces. And so there was just this really large knowledge gap in where I could get started. And then a lot of the time, young people, they do have great ideas, but they just lack guidance in how turning these ideas can be turned into an action. And so they need clear pathways and support to take their first step into advocacy because it's a very daunting world. Just getting thrown in it, or just your first experience, you're not going to know everything, or you're not going to know how to do everything, especially your first time. So it's really important to have like a guiding step and provide those resources and those tools for students to make that change and that really big jump into policy spaces. And so understanding who holds the power and how decisions can be made are also very daunting. It's really important to stress the education on the structures of government, as well as the various roles different officials and, local, state, or even federal governments play, because that's really crucial, knowing how the system works in order to, use student opinions on how they see change to be made. Um, and the legislative language in and of itself is a really big thing to just tackle. It's super, super complex. I remember reading my first bill. I was just astounded. I was like, I don't even know where to begin understanding this. It's so complex. So, this is where teach-ins and workshops and, the resources come in. So you could teach students how to interpret and draft legislation. It could really demystify the process. And I know for the few workshops that I've taught on, the legislative system and how it works, a lot of students, they were really astounded that youth could make a difference in these policy spaces. It's not simply just the lawmaker. It's just the feeling that youth feel this powerless. It's not really students have the power to make change. And so I think highlighting successful examples of youth-led initiatives can really show that change is possible at any age. And I guess really bridging that gap between the organizations and youth is um, super influential. And you could do that through, again, social media. You could do that through teach-ins. You could do that through just resources on a website. Just having that readily available for students can do so much more help than you think it can, because students will look for the opportunity. Sometimes they just don't know where to. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so lack of visibility and trust. So what do we mean by this? So institutions often feel very out of reach, both geographically and just in terms of accessibility. And so we really want to emphasize that bridging the gap requires making these institutions a little bit more approachable and just transparent. So the complexity of these institutions can again be very overwhelming, so it makes it hard to navigate where and how students can get involved. So simply and clearly communicating the engagement opportunities is super essential. And then when consultations when like students feel a little bit more, you know insincere, or they feel like they aren't really being valued, it erodes trust within students. They don't feel like their ideas or their thoughts are very valued in the space, so they'll just tend to get more quiet, or they won't tend to really we won't tend to really emphasize our voices in these spaces, because we don't feel like it really makes too much of a difference, because it's not being emphasized, right? And so that's where genuine engagement and just showing and giving like affirmation to the students that, hey, that was a good idea, or hey, maybe we could build on it by XYZ. But just, addressing youth ideas and thoughts is the first step, and it's a great step. And then poor communication about what is happening and why decisions are made just also again fosters distrust. And then I think a really big thing with the lack of communication around current events, harming trust, is that there's a consistent and clear update about transparency and the processes that could build that credibility back up. Um, yeah, that's a little bit about governments and why youth don't trust them. But let's talk about lack of time and the capacity for youth. So as you know, youth are typically spread very thin. You typically see youth juggling so many things like extracurricular activities, multiple classes, finals, midterms, in high school, college decisions, scholarships, how to financially support themselves in college. It's a lot of these questions that are just, rolling around in students' brains, and it sort of builds up this intensity, and this stress builds up, and it leads to burnout. It leads to mental health issues. But what about also adding time for being involved in these other being civically involved in these other organizations as a youth representative that is unpaid? It just adds another layer of stress on top of it. So I think the biggest thing right here is that youth have a lot of time constraints, so it's really important to have flexible and time efficient opportunities available for these students to accommodate to their busy schedules. And so you could see like this little case study of Max. So Max is a made up character, but for this, he'll show how students are just genuinely struggling with all this. So Max is an ambitious student, and he dreams of making a difference in his community, like many of us youth. He's really and he's very passionate about joining a youth council and leading a student organization. But his schedule is already packed. He has a job. He's in sports. He's getting straight. He's trying to get straight A's, and he feels like every day is just a marathon, and that's the weight of burnout, just going through and through. It's a whirlwind in his head, and it's just going through and through each day. And so dedicating more time to an unpaid role is not a luxury that he can afford. And that's a similar sort of story with a lot of the youth. And I think that's something that a lot of other allied organizations should really take time and consider. And yeah, longevity. Perfect. I was about to say next stage. Okay, so turnover and limited longevity. So typically, there's a lot of change. Many students are often put into short-term roles, so they only last a few months or maybe a single academic year. But it's really hard to achieve change within a few months or a whole year. It oftentimes, especially in policy, means takes more than a few years. We've seen that with the legislative cycle, the congressional legislative cycle. It's not, no policy endeavor is going to be finished in 1 year. It always takes longer than that. And so same with student positions, like it's supposed to be longer than a year, right? So this lack of continuity really hinders the effectiveness and the progress that students can make in these organizations, especially when they have a vision to create that change. And then also just the demanding nature of these roles leads to burnout. So a lot of the time students step down earlier than their term because they have a lot on their plate, like we sort of mentioned before. So that sort of leaves students reluctant to commit time to positions. So, inviting students and creating, I guess, a structural system where students feel safe, and students can, I guess, continue this advocacy amongst like different generations of or like different positions, is really integral to like continuing that change. And I think I'll pass it off to Katie to talk a little bit more about, yeah,
Yes,
discussions.
amazing. Thank you so much, Ria, for kind of laying out the barriers that we've seen. I think at this point we'd like to open up back to you guys before we start talking about solutions. Kind of if there are any barriers you guys have noticed in your work to youth engagement that we haven't mentioned. So that's kind of where the Jamboard is for. The link is on the slideshow again. Let me type it in chat. But if there are any sort of barriers you guys have noticed in your work, or even strategies that you guys have been trying to use to engage young people within your work, we would love to hear. I know we are running like a little bit lower on time, so I might give like 1 or 2 minutes for this, and I might start reading out some answers as they come in, just to kind of save on time. Wow, you guys are so fast. There's already answers. Okay, so like someone says, yeah, disengagement when school attendance is brought up. So what I'm assuming, and like feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, like in the chat or on the Jamboard if I'm interpreting like any of these incorrectly. Kind of getting at like limited capacity. So I think as students, like there's a lot of things to juggle, and sometimes we're forced to prioritize, I think, school or other sort of priorities over like this policy work. So it really gets at like the multiple responsibilities students are juggling. Yeah, lack of motivation, slow to get involved, lack of time. Yeah, I think a lot of times, I don't know if it's like lack of motivation per se, but it is like not being able to figure out like how do I even get involved, or feeling like, oh yeah, if I get involved, like, does it even matter? So making sure you feel like valued. Oh my God, coordinating schedule between multiple youth is such a true one. Like even within I'm laughing because some of you know, like even when we tried to coordinate meetings for like figuring out this presentation, like the number of when to meets we have had to send is insane. So that is definitely a valid concern. I think that is something that I think just being flexible with schedules, just because I think youth, like, they're at school during the day. I think like it is kind of hard sometimes to coordinate, especially meetings between like adult allies and youth, especially if it's like during after hours.
I think also one
Okay.
thing to note
Mhm.
is, oh, just one more thing. I know you mentioned one of the notes in the Jamboard, but when students need to take time off, that's a really big thing. Like when they get stressed or just like so instead of lack of motivation, maybe it's just like, things start piling up and they take a step back. But maintaining that communication between the student and the organization is probably very important. Just wanted to mention that.
Oh my God, these are all so good. Yeah, like moving with the generations and staying up to date on social media platforms for effective digital engagement. Yeah, there's something we actually, I don't know, we haven't talked about enough in this presentation. It's just that youth are like constantly on social media, and that is like one of the best ways to reach social media, but that is also serving as a huge barrier between, I think, sorry, I meant to say that's one of the best ways to reach youth, but that's also such a barrier between like a sort of adult allies and youth, is that I think youth are so familiar with these platforms, but I think adults aren't necessarily like comfortable with these platforms at times. So trying to, I think, bridge that gap, and holding more like media literacy sessions, trying to find platforms where everyone can like be on, and like know how to use. Oh my gosh, so many good replies. I think in interest of time, I might go ahead and sort of continue with this presentation, but I definitely encourage you guys to like read each other's answers as well. Continue thinking about these barriers when we're crafting policies to get youth engaged. So speaking of policies, how can we actually combat these informational and institutional asymmetries that have excluded young people from civically participating in policy discussions pertaining to adolescent mental health? So yeah, let's talk some solutions, at least the ones that we have started to experiment with. As always, we'd love to hear about what solutions you guys have been working with. So I think they kind of fall into four main areas. Number one is being very much intentional about our outreach, our education, and our engagement. So when we talk about incorporating youth voice in policy changes, our number one priority is like sort of sustainability, but also sort of equity. And so something that is really important to us is making sure that youth aren't like, being like just tokenized for their stories, like have their stories taken away and sort of used repeatedly without their own sort of like a knowledge, but also they're equipped with the information, the skills to continue staying in these mental health policy spaces, which is kind of why when like sort of YPP does our sort of education sessions, we focus very much on like sort of skill building of sort of practical examples of like how to write a bill, how to advocate for bills, and making sure that youth are equipped, especially youth who, are from marginalized communities, who are often the ones who have the most sort of most robust, most sort of meaningful lived experiences, they're the ones being equipped with skills to make changes. So that's a huge sort of one sort of solution area that we focus on. Um, we also really highlight the importance of bidirectional feedback channels between youth and policymakers. And this is something Sami touched a lot upon like during what she was talking about, like what does youth empowerment actually look like. So making sure youth are involved in the entire policymaking process rather than being like tokenized at the beginning for their experience or just consult at the end and ask for a sign off just to say, oh, this is youth supported. No, like we want to make sure there are avenues for youth to give input, sort of this back and forth input and dialogue with policymakers sort of throughout the whole process, and that they are like sort of equal partners at the table, that they have opportunities to give their full vote, opportunities to give their ideas, to write policy, instead of just kind of being the ones who have to sort of say, oh, I guess whatever policies you make, we'll follow. Another sort of really important strategy for engaging youth into policy changes is storytelling and sharing of lived experiences. So kind of as this whole presentation alludes to, we do firmly believe that lived experiences is one of the most meaningful ways to influence to sort of inform policy, to reveal like what needs to be changed. So making sure that these stories are really at the forefront of our conversations, that it is students who have these lived experiences that are leading, they're in positions to lead, to shape policy. Super important. Okay, sorry, I know I'm running a little bit late on time, so kind of the last area that we really want to focus on is just like intergenerational collaboration with adult allies, which is kind of where you guys fall in, because adults are in these longer multi-year positions. And I think there's a lot of sort of intersection between youth work and adult work, where we can really support one another. Amazing. So yeah, just to kind of talk about how sort of what we mean when we say like redefine what we mean when we say like intentional outreach. I think it's very important to consider like how we're doing outreach as well, not just having sort of adults sort of reach out to students, but having peers reach out to students. And this connects very much to the peer-to-peer models that we emphasize so much. Like students trust their peers and people who have gone through the same experiences as they do. So one strategy that we really love to rely on is sort of reaching more students through students and people they're familiar with. And yeah, this slide is kind of similar about like what exactly what we teach students about. I think we can just go ahead and skip this. And I just wanted to hand it off to Sanvi to kind of do like a wrap up of solutions.
So I think just to like wrap this up, I know a few of the things that were shared on the Jamboard were like, oh, how do you like combat like lack of motivation? I think it's really important to understand that a lot of the times young people are misconstrued as apathetic about like the issues that they might be facing, but I don't think it's apathy is like the right word. I think disillusionment is a little bit more accurate. I think a lot of young people are keenly aware of like the issues that they're facing and how they can get engaged and have ideas for solutions, as we've discussed throughout this proposal or this presentation. So for us, like the crux of this can boil down to how do we actually build enthusiasm within like youth serving or youth-led spaces to engage further. So I think it's really about like, okay, asking ourselves, when was the last time we were excited about democracy or excited about policymaking? When policymaking and civic processes are upsetting, stressful, or non-responsive, that's when young people tend to disengage. And it's important to meet students where they're at. Community spaces make students feel valued, and oftentimes government and education systems often don't. So collaborating with affinity spaces, with cultural organizations, with spaces that young people are already turning to for support, and building from there, I think is very, very important. Building habits within existing habits. And making this fun, looking at what young people enjoy, listening to these interests, partnering with existing programs to naturally expand joyful partnerships, I think is really, really beneficial and key. But at the end of the day, it's important to champion the principle that lived experience is a needed and valid qualification, and age does not determine stakeholdership or agency in shaping your ability to engage in the policymaking process. That being said, thank you all so much for joining us for our presentation. I know we went a little bit over time, but we wanted to leave a few minutes for questions, just to stay kind of, or if you all want to like stay in touch with us. Katie, I think the next slide has some helpful links. You can also reach our emails or visit our website here, but also we can take the next few minutes to answer any questions in the Q&A. I think I can read the first question out loud from Cassidy. They're asking, I'm wondering if you've tackled any of the issues that come up with youth attending school post-pandemic. The link between what happens at school and mental health is obvious. I've noticed a lot of youth not wanting to attend post-COVID. Yeah, I think that this is an issue, kind of like the transition, especially in an education setting from the pandemic to post-pandemic has been really difficult, but I also think it's been something that we haven't had a lot of conversations about. I think when I have individual conversations with my peers about it, there are very tangible insights on why or where we're coming from when it comes. I think a lot of young people are dealing with severe burnout right now. And also, I think there's like a lot of moving factors where we can't speak on behalf of like all young people in the United States, but I would encourage there to be more dedicated and intentional conversations at the school-based level with students to hear their concerns, because it feels like right now pushing for a sense of pre-pandemic normalcy just isn't working for students, because so much disruption occurred over the pandemic beyond just like staying home. I think it was almost a traumatic experience for a lot of students. So shifting back from that, I think having more human conversations about that will be helpful.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with what Sami was saying about, I think having more conversations with students about like what is stopping them. I think something as well, and this kind of relates to what we're talking about with building systems of mental health in schools that support like recovery rather than penalization. I think not a lot of schools don't acknowledge that the pandemic was pretty like just like, I mean, not traumatizing is the right word, but I think it has like reframed of how we look at school and kind of our priorities, as well as like how much we like are willing also to commit to like sort of like academic priorities as well, and sort of understanding like how youth perspectives on this have shift, creating systems that are understanding and I think compassionate to youth, especially students who have had major life changes, who have lost people in their lives and are still struggling to adjust to this. I think creating systems that are more understanding of kind of why youth may be more disengaged, I think is very important, and also does a lot in making sure youth feel like these systems are there to support them and be our spaces they want to be putting themselves in and actively showing up to. Yeah.
Yeah, and just bouncing off
Okay.
of Katie and Sanvi's 2 seconds. So post-pandemic, I was a senior. It was a first year fully back, and I think the most helpful thing my teacher ever did was do a listening circle with the entire class, and we sort of got very vulnerable with each other. It was very community-based. Some of it went into tears, but it doesn't have to get that emotional, but I'm just maybe putting it out there that having a listening circle and, for educators, although it may be a little bit daunting, but have a listening ear. It goes a long way, especially post pandemic. And students are very receptive. You may think that they'll just be like, oh, whatever, but students are very receptive when they know that their teacher is in their corner.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Do you have time for another question? I'm not sure. Okay, maybe I'll just read another question. Like, at what age? Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure if Tay came on.
I
Well, okay.
just want to express that we have an absolute hard stop at the hour. So if you can answer it within exactly a minute, we can do it.
Okay, yeah. Well, Shaylee is asking, at what age should we really start taking youth opinions into consideration, or should we base it more on lived experience? I think this is a good question because I don't really think there's a line you can say, oh, this is when we start like taking youth opinions into account. I think it is very much about lived experiences. If youth have an experience they want to share, I think it is not our place to like say you can't share it and that's not important. I think regardless of age, I think it's something we've emphasized that regardless of age, those who have been affected by mental health or systems or a lack of these systems have very real experiences they're worth taking into account. So I think age should not be a factor when we talk about engaging youth. don't know if other people have like 2 cents they want to add, or if we want to just wrap up the session. Thank you guys so much, by the way, for all these questions. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to these. These are really good questions.
Feel free to email us if you want to, continue conversations or set up another meeting. But yeah.
Gosh, y'all, I can't thank you enough. Thank you for a brilliant, amazing session, Youth Power Project. Thank you all so much. We've got to close out. We're at time, but we've got our next keynote coming up in 30 minutes. My friend Liz, I'm so excited. I will be there, so I hopefully will see you in about 30 minutes. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Bye.